This is gonna break things. Alrighty. So welcome to my Tim Hollister and I's talk about no estimates or estimates. Don't do stupid things on purpose, or alternatively, we should abandon story points. I'm Samantha Eggy. I work at Vertifor as a SM and software engineer, and I will be joined by Tim Hollister, who also works at Vertifor as a SM and QA. Throughout this talk, definitely feel free to either leave comments in the chat or feel free to pop off mute, ask questions. This is definitely an interactive talk. It's a very casual, so feel free to interact with the talk whenever you have a question or counterpoint or anything else.
So quick overview on what we're going to be talking about, a little bit of why story points, where they came from, why they became popular, a little bit of the point two, a little bit of the application of story points, how they fit into our day-to-day practice if your organization is using them. Then a little brief summary of the no estimates movement, and then some experimenting with story points in our organization. And you'll probably notice as we're talking about these, there's not really clear demarcations between any given point here. There's going to be some overlap in our discussion, which is just nature of talking about things. So why story points? So the story point is at least credited back to a guy named Ron Jeffries, who ran an Agile team back in the XP days, and be surprised that, like a lot of things in Agile, story points grew out of that. The idea was that back in his day that estimates were done in this thing called an ideal day, which was dev heads down, no interruptions. And because that's kind of mythical, that ideal day was a multiplier was thrown into that, and that's where their estimates came from. And just because humans are lazy, ideal day got shrunk down into days, and people crazy as stakeholders took a day, 3 days to mean 3 days, which is, if you're not in the dev world, that is, I think, an understandable interpretation. And to avoid that sort of confusion, Jeffries started calling, rather than days, just story points. And that got the ball rolling to where we are today. Bit of trivia, if you care. All right, so what do we get out of story points? What are they good for, at least on paper? Story points are helpful in making predictions. Your team averages 10 points a sprint. You've got 30 points on your backlog. Relatively simple math is saying 3 sprints, at least on paper, we should be ready to go to production. They can help us determine what the next thing our team should pick up. Even if if you have something that's we think is a relatively small effort, but you're reasonably confident it's going to be kind of low on the list of priorities for your customer, maybe that's not the next thing you want your team to pick up. So weighing effort versus business value, story points are a big help in that. They can help us identify when a story is getting a little bit too big for that team, when we can make effective or vertical slices to try to stay as efficient as possible. And when your team is experimenting, we think in our retro, we think this path might help us be more effective. And so you run through that experiments a few weeks and you realize you've gone from averaging X points to X minus 2 points per sprint, then that, maybe that experiment didn't have the outcome you wanted, or maybe you're up 2 points and it's something you want to keep doing. And story points are helpful. They can help your team, new members of your team all get into alignment just as a group, or if your team is been dropped into a new domain. Story points, again, can ensure that common understanding so that everybody is moving in the same direction.
I do want to, so domain is a term that we've been using at Vertifor for a little bit, but just in case people aren't familiar, like domain is essentially, sorry, I did not grab water before this, which was probably my fault. Domain is kind of like a specific set of business logic or functionality that other parts of the application or the business can interface and work around in order to interact with that piece of logic. So this is coming into the idea of teams organizing around a specific set of business logic. In case that was new terminology.
Right, so story points at planning. So Vertifor is, at least parts of us are on are using a SAFE model, which implements quarterly planning events. So planning out 6-week sprints. Little bit of a footnote on this one. When I first came into Vertifor, that's what my train was doing, my group of teams. And we found frequently that we rolled out of planning, we closed planning, we felt like we had something really solid, everybody was confident about it, confident enough at least to move forward. And then by sprint 3, if we're lucky, by sprint, we made it to sprint 4, before we're in a conference room again, rejiggering our stories, trying to realign things. Let's see, then kind of out of necessity, monthly planning, that's another thing that some more teams in my organization are doing. Interesting that my train kind of shifted to that, just kind of out of necessity, because oftentimes we were going into planning where we just didn't have enough identified work to fill out those 6 sprints. And of course, then there's sprintly planning, where at the end of every sprint, that is where you're doing the planning for the next couple of weeks. And all of those, what all those things have in common is that story points can help you with that heat check, where you play your story point, story Jenga or story Tetris, take a step back, and then let's be sure you haven't overloaded your team, haven't overcommitted. And we've got commitments in quotes, because at least in my opinion, the word commitment can turn your sprint into a death march. And I think that's kind of contrary to the whole idea of being agile. And yeah, that's my soapbox. I don't like for it. And of course, reporting or metrics for organizations. There are some organizations that use those story points for some decision making that at the senior levels. Sam, anything?
No, yeah, I think you nailed it.
Okay.
Just like the interaction of utilizing story points or velocity into our planning ceremonies in the variety of ways that they are, and then organizations attempting to use those numbers or that guesswork in various different types of reporting and metrics. And those things could potentially be existent in your organization and definitely vary organization to organization. And that's definitely, oh goodness, my dog is acting up once.
Yes.
There. Yeah. So and that kind of brings us into no estimates. I think you snagged this slide this time around.
Oh, I did. Okay. So there are 2 bullet points from the Manifesto of Agile Software Development that we think fit pretty neatly into this no estimates discussion. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools, and responding to change over following a plan. And I think both of those things speak really well to kind of the futility of estimates, because using those things kind of nails us down and is sort of contrary to the manifesto. Oh, sorry. Interesting bit of trivia for that. I saw a YouTube video which I was going to drop a link for, and I completely forgot to do that. But one of the signatories talked about people shortening Agile Manifesto. I'm using that phrase, Agile Manifesto, rather than Manifesto for Agile software development. And he kept getting these mental images of a document kind of parkouring itself around the room, and just an amusing story for me. It might be not for you. That's fine. Okay. That's all I had.
So I think when to move to no estimates, this is one of those things where if story points or velocity are no longer being a tool or being useful within the Scrum team. So I'm talking about for the developers or QAs, PO, however you organize your Scrum team, if it's no longer providing value in effective feedback for that team, that's definitely a time to start looking away from no estimates. The ability to start moving towards the utilization of other tools to be able to facilitate in forecasting how much time work will take, or figuring out what the future of your team or your domain looks like, and the aspects of team health. Leaning on story points and velocity is definitely one of those things where if you're taking what is essentially guesswork and using it to measure things that are not relevant, you are likely to take away the wrong interpretations of that information. All tools are not inherently bad or good, right? As long as they are understood of the implications and what the purpose is and how they can be utilized in a team or an organization, and understanding the implication of those things, that's what's valuable. For the most part, though, story points and velocity definitely struggle in the fact that they're frequently used in anti-patterns in regards to true agile methodology, and can usually be misconstrued by the organization of what they mean or what they represent, especially when they're taken outside of the team. Another thing, like some of the, as your internal Scrum team, reasons to start looking past moving towards story points or equivalents, like if you're using hours or if you're using days within your organization, like all of these things fall into this realm. Comfort within your domain or the work that you're doing, trust within your team, with the direct managers, with the stakeholders that these teams are going to be delivering value, or either working towards changing the lack of trust there in any of those realms in order to enable you to move past putting numbers on estimated work, and also willingness to experiment and iterate within the individual Scrum team or as a larger organization. So story points and estimates are absolutely have been baked into agile workflows and organizations for a long time. So it's familiar, it's an understandable idea and concept. People can relate to it. So trying to move past it, trying to move to the next iteration or the next step of agility, that willingness to like experiment and iterate and try and improve processes is definitely going to be key to trying to be successful and moving away from some of these number-based assignment to development work. I thought I saw someone wanting to come off mute. Did anyone want to? I thought I saw a mouth or two move there. Okay. Moving to no estimates. If you're moving away from, let me preface this with, I think that the most ideal way of working for software development teams that are truly wanting to be agile is probably a good mix between Kanban and Scrum. Like that middle ground of teams will always focus on the thing that is providing the next most valuable piece of work. Like that is always the focus, regardless of sprint boundaries, regardless of, whether or not that has an assigned piece of hours. The team is trying to provide iterative, small, valuable pieces of work and will always pull in and prioritize the next most valuable piece of work. To Tim's point earlier in the presentation, if your organization is planning in quarters or longer or any amount of that, if development and Scrum teams are spending time trying to assign some sort of point values to story to be used in planning, with a heavy lead time ahead of actually pulling in and accomplishing that work, you'll have to re-estimate. You might have to re-examine and re-look and re-remember all of that work that you estimated ahead of time for the sake of planning. Putting story points on a story or hours or days is not the same as forecasting. Those are different concepts. And so this can definitely be a benefit to moving towards no estimates, because you're not enforcing teams to have to waste time performing these kinds of ceremonies or check marks in regards to planning and refining work. There's also a ton of anti-patterns that can occur when using velocity and story points. One of those is playing sprint Jenga, or how can I hit 100% capacity to hit a velocity measure? And from there, you're not focusing on the next most valuable piece of work. You're focusing on how do I get 100% capacity out of my developers, which is both A, not focusing on how to deliver value to customers, and B, 100% capacity for any development team is a terrible idea, just straight up. No estimates in practice. My team stopped using story points or any sort of measurements or pre-estimates, so hours, days, however, value in a time or effort sense. We stopped using that for stories. At least this says 6 months, 6+ months ago, but it's probably closer to 8 months. My team has found that we are definitely moving towards more flexible sprint boundaries, which we have to kind of like work around within regards to our organization. But we are always prioritizing the next most important piece of value. Like that is what our focus is. It's not about trying to make the numbers look nice. Like we are having trust that this Scrum team will be putting forth the necessary efforts to keep moving forward to delivering value to the organization and to our customers. And from there, that we will always be prioritizing that next piece. Team morale is good. Over the last 8 months, we have never considered bringing back any of those kinds of measurements. So as part of the no estimates experiment, there are some concerns in regards to moving away from like story points or hours or days or whatever your organization kind of uses in regards to putting numbers on pieces of work. And so some of the things that my team in specific chose to go around this route is story points became routine rather than useful. So they became something we did by habit and not because they were providing value to the team. Because of that, we just kind of stopped doing it on a normal cadence, and kept forgetting about it and kept forgetting about it. And then we eventually made the intentional decision to stop using estimates and start moving towards how my team works now. We also stopped doing sprint Jenga and fighting against the sprint boundaries that my organization uses as part of this experiment. So that's some of the reasons why my team personally started going into this and why we chose this route and why I started looking up no estimates. Some of the concerns around that, unable to commit to delivery dates, misunderstanding of the work needed prior to the work starting, increase in carryover or light sprints across sprint boundaries, and concerns with being able to provide the necessary metrics to the organization. I'd also like to see like anyone say if any of these concerns are relevant to their organization, because like
I actually was going to ask you about, well, the last one and the second one. I think it's pretty common for teams to get into like a feature and then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, this thing is not what it appeared to be. It's way bigger. And so how do your teams handle that? And then I can see, like, you mentioned you're in safe, and I can see like a concern, and how do you satisfy like the reporting needs that go to the organization overall?
So I will tackle the second point first. So this is a combination of like a trust and an understanding, like between the team, like a trust and a willingness to fail and a willingness to like talk across your team, or within if you have more individual dev members and less of a team environment, the willingness to be honest about what you're doing. The lack of estimates doesn't change anything about the fact that an estimate would be guesswork. And to your point, where you made the note where, oh, we got into it and we learned as we went, and now we want to change direction, or it was more or less effort than we thought it was. Like, there's nothing about the estimates that provided value, right? Because if this is really the most important thing for this team to be doing, how did numbers contribute? How did those like potential numbers contribute to the ahead of time, knowing the unknown unknowns, the iteration as you're moving into a project? Like, as software developers and as providing value to our organization and our customers, our number one value should always be providing iterative and consistent value of the next most important thing. And part of the issue with story points and estimates and et cetera is it sometimes ties us into commitments on a board, or where that's not necessarily where we should have gone, and is not a reliable, like, oh yes, this is a 3. You will see it in 3 days. Like, that's not software development. Software development is a creative field. And
yeah, and I'm wondering, and maybe do you guys use WizGIF? Because I think like what I see a lot is
what?
WizGIF, like weighted shortest job first, right?
Wait, can you slow that down and restart that?
Weighted shortest job first. So we used to
Oh.
do that on the GovTrain way back in the day, where we would put all the stories together after we had groomed them with Alan. And then essentially Alan and Leslie would then go through and weight the estimate that we gave against the customer impact. And based on some mathematical formulation, which was like, I don't know what it was, but you could basically figure out, like, for the least amount of effort, this would have the most impact to customers. So we would do that one first and then work our way down the list that way.
Yeah,
And
and
do
to be
that.
clear, I'm not a huge fan, like necessarily a fan. I'm just asking from an experience working in that type of environment.
So not specifically that exercise. So how we prioritize our work is we say, these are the most important things, no matter the heck, like for customer value. These are absolutely it. These are absolutely a thing.
Mhm.
And then we have like some items in our back pocket that are like usually smaller lifts that if a team member feels like they're like treading water or like has some time, they'll like pull in these like smaller, like touchy stories, just like whatever, essentially. Like so we have our backlog organized like that, and that is one approach. We don't have like an official like diagram, but like we definitely have like 3 items in our backlog right now that are like, these aren't ideal, but they are not the thing that will deliver the most value for the customer, but they are wonky. So if someone has like a couple of hours in the afternoon before diving into this next most piece of valuable work, you know, like these are on deck. And so that's kind of how we handle that. My team is also pretty good about being flexible. Like, we care less about sprint boundaries. We just try and do like each piece of storied work and pull that in as we have time and space. But there's also like a lot of trust between like my team in talking about these problems and discussing them and making sure that we have them appropriately refined. There's trust between the Scrum team and our managers. There's trust between my team and the stakeholders that we will continuously deliver and attempt to deliver value. Yeah. So did that answer that bullet point? And I know Elizabeth was the one with the questions, but if anyone else wanted to ask anything around any of those pieces, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I think I'm good.
Did you see any like inflation of those estimates prior to putting these changes into place? Because with some of my other teams at the last job I had, when we were using story points and using that for the burn down, we saw this gradual inflation because people were using it as, this is how much work you got done. And we tried to put the kibosh on it, but they, you know, people stuck to it on that one. Did you see any inflation kind of happening, like that artificial inflation? Because I feel like it's something, especially when you have a lot of teams, that you can see, especially if it gets interpreted by leadership or middle management as, you know, here's what you're getting done. Why are they getting 32 points and you're only getting 14? And we started to fall into that a little bit where I work now, but we didn't completely stop using story points, but we stopped making them part of our velocity. So we judge our velocity now by the number of stories that are done. And we saw an immediate decrease in the number of large stories.
Yeah, so I think it's one of those things. Absolutely, like, fantastic question and some examples there. So to your point, story points and velocity, because they're like strictly numbers and can be extracted from the context in which within the internal team. Like, I think story points, as long as it is only used within the Scrum team in which they originated, I think that is the only acceptable like place for story points. I think
Okay.
as soon as you start pulling them out of that, like,
Yeah, we had
for instance,
issues.
yes, like for instance, my organization uses it to change story points into hours that devs spend towards objectives, which like, and I've also seen the comparison of story points or attempt to say, why are you not at 100% velocity? Why are you over 100%? Like, totally, like, story points and velocity are incredibly, I think, can be used as such bad anti-patterns for agility that the benefits for them are not worth the cost or the risk as an organization. And I think like a lot of the difficulties there are like trying to, it's not the dev teams. I mean, like dev teams will probably feel a little uncertain. Like if they've been using story points for 10 years, moving off story points is going to be scary. Like that's how, how do we plan? Like, how do we accept this new risky thing? But like,
Yeah,
there's
and
also,
that's why we just let them keep doing their story points, but we're not looking at that, right? So
yeah. And so it is one of those things where in one of the previous slides, I was losing internet connection, so I just dropped the screen share. Let me see if I can't reshare and not crash. In one of the previous slides, I talked about like part of this transition is, whether you're calling them story points or not, part of this transition is you have to have trust within your team to make the transition, with your managers to support you in that transition, and then also with stakeholders in organization, because they're so accustomed to agility means that I can count the story points that people are outputting. And it just leads to so many anti-patterns. Like so many contemporaries in the agile field have largely turned away from the concept of story points, just because of specifically the capital A agile TM versus agility is not the same. And the capital A agile TM largely uses story points in the way that is destructive and isn't helpful. I feel like that was a lot of rambling.
that's okay. So is my question.
I'm trying to think if I missed any points. I do think internal to the Scrum team, only internal use of story points, there is a really good value. And I think to your point, like you said like the teams were continuing to use it only internal, is the heat check of, if you don't have a talkative team, which happens, like that's not necessarily the end of the world, but having that heat check of like, do we all think we understand what this might mean? It only gets into, I think, more anti-patterns if you're doing that level of refinement of work 3 months out, 4 months out, like ahead of like pulling in the story directly, because you're going to have to relearn that anyways, right? Or re-estimate, or maybe you learned and the estimate that you spent time on 3 months ago is no longer relevant. Like, I think that's another dangerous part of like getting story points and quarterly planning that like safe teams kind of use. Reporting. If you give me specifics about reporting issues that you are, maybe we can hold this to the very end and keep going. But reporting is going to be on a case-by-case basis and is going to be very much about trust within the organization and figuring out how, like, what and why they're trying to measure things and find a way that is not guesstimates to deliver that, because guesswork is not a good way to measure anything. But that's like traditionally a very like agile perspective. And so if we can drive them away from that, or like have them realize that story points and velocity and other such measures are not a commitment or in a reliable measure, I think you can try and drive towards better measurements and better metrics. I think that's my short answer on that one. So we're going to close with an enjoyable quote here. This is from Todd Miller. He's a professional Scrum trainer, host of Your Daily Scrum, and has written a book. And during one of the episodes of Your Daily Scrum, he said the following: story points and velocity are some of the most destructive things we've seen in organizations. They definitely can be. I don't disagree with him. Thank you. Tons of resources. Any additional questions or just banter or experiences? Disagreements too, like also open to that.
I have questions.
Yeah.
All right. So the way that you explain this, always prioritizing the next important piece of value, and dropping the sprint boundaries really feels to me like you're doing Kanban and not Scrum, which is fine. I'm just trying to reconcile how at that point it's any different from just saying that you've switched to doing Kanban.
So this kind of gets into the philosophical. I think the best combination of agility, from my opinion, people can definitely disagree. I think, from my opinion, the best actual agility in software development, software engineering is kind of like a mix of Kanban and Scrum. I think we too often hold hard to some of the principles or ceremonies of one or the other. But like, I think really, if we look like 5 years down the line, we'll see companies like hitting sort of like this mix between the two, which is like, first of all, so the benefits to Scrum is like you're trying to time box and making sure that you're splitting things into iterative content. You're having regular celebrations with your team and being like, yay, like we should, like we're sending out this next piece of iterative content. You're having there's like regular planned like retrospectives of the team and the efforts over the previous, like I think some of those things have value, right? Like on a regular cadence. Otherwise, particularly in the land of COVID, if you don't have anything to like break up those stretches of work, or you're not trying to implement those things, you get into a death march. And then you're like, what did I even do for 4 months? Like if I'm just like spinning in the next piece of like whip content. But I think like Kanban also has like this very powerful effect of a Kanban board is literally a list of the next most important thing that you can do, with maybe like interspersed of like the light, easy, what is that called? Easy apples to grab off the tree, like
Low-hanging fruit.
Low-hanging fruits. Thank you. Struggled there. But it is always like these are our next most important pieces of work. And whether that is one day or whether that is 4 weeks, we are acknowledging that this is the most valuable thing that we can provide our customer. I think on the other hand, Scrum also, as part of sprint boundaries and having those containers, helps try to encourage slicing for the Scrum team, or Scrum Kanban teams, whatever. Like, it encourages that slicing and making sure that you're not saying, man, I'm going to like build out something for 6 months and then ship it and then learn that everything that I assumed or thought was wrong. So like, I really think the ideal agility for a team is kind of somewhere in the middle. But I don't think that we are like there yet across organizations and as an agile community. But in my opinion, I think that's then like I think that's where peak performance comes from, or like peak agility comes from. If that answered your question, Zach. And you definitely disagree.
It's yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't mean to go back to my experience at Vertifor, but the way that you explain what you're doing now is very similar to the way that the architecture team was operating within sprint boundaries, but not adhering to getting anything done within the sprint itself. We were using the sprint boundaries to kind of just make sure like that we were indeed had everything that we knew about, and we're prepping ourselves for any interruptions that we knew may be coming in the next few weeks from other development teams to have to help them out.
Mhm.
But mainly we were always trying to work on the most important thing, and working on that until it got completed.
Yeah.
And not, you know, if it took 5 weeks, which is basically 2.5 sprints, or if it took 3
Mhm.
weeks or 1 week, it didn't matter. We just worked on it until either the priority changed or we got it done. So yeah. And we never pointed anything either.
Yeah, well, I
Yeah.
think you guys called yourself a Kanban team in a Scrum organization. So you guys,
Mhm.
I think, accidentally fell into that, like that good, I think, like best mixing ground of those two ideas by accident. Like, well, maybe not by accident. Like that might be insulting.
Well, no, we were very interrupt driven, and we also didn't have any real deliverables outside of like making sure that maybe a piece of infrastructure or something was there for a team or helping them out
Mhm.
with a particular issue. I guess that leads me to my other question, which was like, how do you determine when content gets out? Are you still adhering to the typical deployment cadence that was there when I was there, basically deploying at the end of every sprint? Just basically at the end of every sprint, whatever is on the main branch, just deploying that out, and keeping other stuff, just holding it until it gets finished.
Yes, actually.
Okay.
And so this is something we covered in the internal talk. And so I don't know how much this is gonna relate or like make sense to everybody else, but really quick background. So at Vertifor, we have 2-week sprints. Every 2 weeks we deploy to UAT. For every 2 sprints, so 4 weeks, we deploy to production. So we have a 2 sprint production cycle, a 1 sprint, every single sprint UAT cycle. So yes, we are still adhering to like those deadlines and timelines. We just kind of acknowledge and work around them. Like, we know what kind of work can go up and get promoted to higher environments. We know because of our familiarity with like what needs to stay down. And this is UAT, user acceptance testing.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm glad the other Vertifornians were able to back me up there. User acceptance testing. So we just kind of work around it. Like, it's because we are pretty centralized into domains and aren't like tied into monoliths that might have like 4 or 5 teams all working in the same code base. It's much easier for us to choose what goes up and what doesn't go. There are, like, of course, on occasions where we have to work in a service or a piece of code that might be heavier traffic from multiple other teams, where we kind of have to negotiate or maybe spend a little bit of time or thinking on like how to deploy that up and what we can deploy up. But for the most part, like, we're pretty segregated. So like our services and our pieces of the code are really easy for us to be like, we started this on the last Wednesday of the sprint. We knew we weren't going to get it done, but we were like promoting pieces to our testing environment. And we're just not going to deploy that version of this piece of code up. So that's pretty much how we handle it.
So I thought it was interesting that you made a distinction between estimates and forecasting. And I'm curious, in terms of forecasting, you talk about, and I'm guessing it's probably based on the most, like, what provides the next most amount of value. Is that sort of how you forecast and just kind of run down the list? Or do you have a different method?
So forecasting, I'm still in my baby stages of getting good at forecasting. Forecasting is less about an individual story and the story points associated with, and more about so there's this idea of roadmap planning, which is now, next. Oh goodness, the last column is going to kill me. Now, next, or eventually, or future. Like, it's one of those where rather than telling the organization, yes, I will have that done in 45 days, which in software development is not a reasonable commitment. Like, either you're lying, you're killing your staff, or you're making like potentially like bad decisions in regards to the work that you're delivering, like, because you're conforming to in a very creative field, you're conforming to a very specific date. Like, you are making other compromises along the way, right? Like, that's just the nature of it. And so forecasting is less about, we will add this API to expose this and assign like effort values to it, but it's more like, okay, so we want to add this new feature. And from like the technical folks on the field that are experts in that domain, we think some MVPs can be done in this amount of time. Or like, if you want to do this approach, like this, like very like broad strokes of like what the forecast of those things and being able to weigh them against each other. It's not a commitment, it's not like hard line, but it allows the business to kind of like talk about like the pros and cons of various things, efforts and weights, in a way that isn't commitments in the way story points are, or like promises of time and efforts. If forecasting is also less about specific like acceptance criteria and more about delivering a section of value to a customer. Like, I want to improve how we register users. That's like a thing on the roadmap. That's your now category. And maybe your next category is like, we want a way to invite users to our service. like whatever, like, and that's in the next. And so like forecasting is a way to like figure out like what that kind of roadmap looks like in a way that isn't like blatant dishonesty, because story points are guesses, and the way that the way that the community kind of uses them and organizations frequently use them is not as a magic 8 ball, which can cause some bad anti-patterns within teams.
So yeah, I think I've seen like for forecasting, basically, are you doing it more like at a feature level and then saying like this PI approximately this, we think that next PI might be something like that type of forecast?
Yeah, and I'm still pretty new. This is the next on my this book right here has been highly recommended by a number of people who are way smarter than me at Agile. So when will it be done? Lean Agile forecasting. That's on my to read list. So maybe during those lightning talks, once I've read this book, I can give a little lightning talk on it. But yes.
I will have to send you, there's another book I read that was kind of instrumental in my understanding of forecasting versus estimates, but the name escapes me right now. I know it's like right over here.
Is it Accelerate?
No, I'll have to go. I don't think so. I'll have to find it.
Okay. Send me a DM.
Yeah, I will, for sure.
Any other questions?
Not a question, but a comment. I I wish I could have got something like this at the last job I worked at, because there it was a commitment, and my boss used the word commitment all the time. And then it was a government contract, and it was written in the contract that each developer was going to finish on average 6 points of work. So it wasn't even, they were trying to take the whole organization and kind of standardize what a point was. So it wasn't even like the team, this is a point on this team, might not be a point on that team, might not. And it was frustrating.
I don't want to. That sounds awful, and I'm not trying.
I don't work there anymore.
Like, this is like an example of like extreme anti-patterns that story points drive too, and it's one of those things where it's like what you measure, like what is the phrase? Like what you measure is the goal that you're going to try to achieve. That's not the exact quote, but it's like if you're like, I want you to deliver 6 story points, people will be delivering 6 story points, right? Like it doesn't matter about the value. It's they executed some, like it removes it away from any sort of value measurements. And sorry, I saw you come off mute.
Oh no, you're fine. No, I was agreeing. Yeah, no, it was there is a good reason why I don't work there anymore.
This is why I say the phrase capital A agility TM versus like agility. You know. And that was a very good and painful story. Thank you for sharing, Casey. Anybody else? Any questions? Any comments?
At what point do you, this is something that I always struggled with in Kanban. At what point do you have the team stop working on a story that is taking a lot longer than anyone had originally anticipated? If that makes sense. Like,
no,
so yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Did you want to add to that? Because
Well, one of the things that I'm thinking about is right now at Blizzard, they're just now adopting Scrum, where they didn't really have any type of I should say, universal development methodology. It was really just everyone do whatever you want. I don't know. I came on and then they started to implement processes of, hey, we'd like to standardize the way that we're doing stuff. We'd like to do sprints. Could teams start like grooming or refining the stories and thinking about things like that? So within those confines, when we're estimating a story, and we can talk about it up front and realize that, hey, what's being asked of us in this particular story is a lot of work. Let's split it up so that it's more manageable by maybe multiple people or something like that. In the olden days, when I was doing Kanban stuff, we would get a story that was basically do the Oracle 19C upgrade. And it didn't really matter how we split that up, because basically it was just, yeah, I'll take it and it'll be on the backlog and I'll be working on it over the course of the next 6 weeks. Doesn't really matter. You see what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
that kind of goes back to not having to deliver that content. Really, it's more just, yeah, I'm working on it. Then when it gets done a few months after that point, we're actually going to do the Oracle 19C upgrade. So, yeah.
So I think this is where, so sorry, my dog wanted to go outside, so now we're sitting on the porch, so I'm off camera. But this is kind of like the point where, like, I think the true future of Agile is a combination of Kanban and Scrum, because iterative value and getting feedback early and often to kind of help drive, like for instance, right now my team has two huge technical projects back to back, which is, it's going to be sweeping at least 6 weeks per, if not more. And so it's trying to find that crossroads of like finding venues to get feedback from whoever your stakeholders or your user base is, and trying to, the art of story slicing and like figuring out how to find slices of deliverable work is an art form in itself, especially amongst software engineering, as well as finding good ways to get feedback about work that is being done in a meaningful way that can help you figure out, like, before you've spent 6 or 8 weeks on something, that you're getting feedback sooner about like pieces of this entire feature set, and making sure that you're on the right track or that you're not getting lost. And whether that's technical feedback in regards to like the WebLogic C upgrade, like that might be like technical feedback and iteration, or if it's a product facing piece of like, we do have these UX, we are going to deliver this little piece of the UX, see what customers or the user base thinks about it and iterate. You definitely don't. Some of the problem with Kanban is that you could potentially fall back into waterfall, which is you hit that point of I'm gonna deliver 8 weeks of work at once and hope everyone likes it, right? And so that's why I think like the middle ground of Scrum and Kanban is really where the future of agility is. If that makes sense. And if that answers your question. And if it doesn't, like, feel free to ask clarifying questions. I think it's a combination. Ultimately, it's a combination of finding a venue on a regular basis to get feedback on from whoever the end people are, whether that's internal, external, whatever. And then also having at least one person on the team who can help the team split stories into reasonable chunks, whether that's on a Kanban board or on a Scrum board.
Thanks.
Did that answer your question or?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. I'll give it the 20 seconds of awkward silence to see if there's any additional questions or commentary or stories that anyone wants to add.
I put a note in the chat. The book I was referencing was Manage It by Joanna Rothman. I would say it's not necessarily agile, but it was not agile in that it doesn't prescribe like Scrum or Kanban, but I thought it was agile in the sense of like the Agile Manifesto. And I'll say it's been several years, so my philosophy may have changed since I read it, but your mileage may vary.
I honestly think one of my favorite articles, oh goodness, I might have to post it in the Agile Lansing code channel because I'll have to find it. One of my favorite articles that I think really reflected agile thinking wasn't even about agility. So like I'm totally on the same page as you, but like I read it and I did nothing but spam all of my coworkers and people that I know with like quotes from that. So understandable.
Yeah. And I was looking, I think we had George when did he talk? And he talked about no estimates at one point. I think he wrote a book, but I have not read it yet. That was, what was that called? Oh, hold on. I saw it. I'll find it later.
Oh, I did find the article. Oh no, Teams is being terrible.
I guess George's book isn't necessarily no estimates, it's software estimation without guessing.
That sounds like no estimates, but from
In my mind, yeah. Estimate is a guess.
let's see if this is it. Hey, yep, this is the article. So I'll drop this in here. I loved this entire article. Wait. Yep, I think this is the core of agility. I'll make sure to drop that in the Agile Slack channel as well.
Yeah, I will have to read that.
Yeah, any closing thoughts, questions, concerns? We're all going to drop story points tomorrow.
I would love to.
I didn't necessarily have permission when my team stopped using story points. So if you ever want to get around the system, my team has definitely done that. So if you want some advice.
I would drop a whiz gif in a moment. Not only is it the worst acronym ever, it's kind of the most painful process ever.
We've been at Vertifor, we've been thinking a lot about a lot of the agile ceremonies that are like required. There's lots of air quotes going on right now. And trying to rethink about like how to actually make them useful and like reassessing like are we doing them because we are used to doing them, or are we doing them because they're providing value? And that was essentially what led me down the no estimates, and eventually moving my team out of estimates. It is getting to that why question of like, it's not providing value. Asking for yes, asking for forgiveness is definitely easier than asking for permission. Have I caught some heat since I've done this? Yes, a little bit. I also like the quote of radiate intent and not asking permission. And so I do a lot of radiating intent for the changes and processes that my team tries to make internally.